Okay, welcome to the Poison Garden. My name's Trevor and I'm the head gardener at the garden. Now, the Poison Garden is just a small part of the overall Alnwick Garden, but it's a really popular area for our visitors. It's a gated garden, so people aren't allowed in unless they go in with the guide. And the reason for that is that within that garden, we have over 100 plants, which all have the ability to harm you in one way or another. And in fact, some of them actually have the ability to kill you. So it is a very poisonous garden. So if we can go in through the gates, which are normally always kept locked, and we will take you on a virtual tour of the garden. Right, if we can open the gate, boys, and go in. Now, before we let anybody into this garden, we always do a health and safety briefing. So we advise them not to stand too close to the plants or touch the plants, or definitely not pick the plants, because they all have the ability to kill you in one way or the other. So the first bed we come to, we can actually see something that's really common, and it's rhubarb. Now, how many of you thought that rhubarb was actually poisonous? In fact, the stems, as we all know, can be eaten quite well, but the foliage is a huge problem. It's very toxic, and if people eat it, they start to absorb the toxins into their body and have a huge problem with their stomachs. It also increases blood pressure and people become very unwell indeed. So the stems are fine, but don't eat the leaves. Often people ask if they should compost the leaves. Well, yes, it's fine. You can put the rhubarb leaves on your compost. As long as you don't eat them, then you'll survive. Okay, so if we can go down to the next bed. Now the next plant, which is directly in front of us, many of you might recognise, it's a laburnum tree. Now quite often, if you ask people about poisonous plants, they'll all remember the laburnum. As you can see, it's in full flower just now. The flowers, once they're finished, will produce little tiny pea-like seeds. And this gives us a problem because many children think that it is actually something edible, because they do resemble peas because they come in pea pods. In fact, the whole of this tree is poisonous. In fact, the most poisonous part is actually the stem, because just under the bark there are lots of stored toxins. So children often have an issue with this, and although the plant won't kill you, it does cause huge stomach problems. And so when children eat the seeds, thinking that they're peas, they then have to be taken to hospital and have their stomachs pumped. Now you have to eat quite a lot of the seeds, but obviously children don't know that. But the more they eat, the poorer they will actually become until they're hospitalized. Now you'll notice as we go down through the garden, we have cages. The cages are there because within the cages, we have what we consider to be our most dangerous plants. So this cage here has got a salvia in it. Now, salvia is a very common garden plant, but this is Salvia divinorum, and it became a huge problem about 10 years ago because public school boys, funny enough, found out that if they made tea from the leaves, then they would get an instant high. It's a hallucinogenic. So by taking the fresh leaves from the tips of the plants, putting them into a teapot, pour boiling water on, let it simmer for perhaps 2 or 3 minutes, pour the liquid out, and then when they drank it, they started these hallucinogenic journeys or trips. Apparently one of the side effects of this is that you think you can fly. And so an awful lot of young people started to think that they could fly, and they jumped off desks, they jumped off chairs, but then they started to jump off flyovers and also railway bridges and fell to their death. And at one point, if you went on YouTube, you could actually see somebody hanging themselves. So a very dangerous plant. This plant that we're looking at now is a Tropa belladonna. It's a native to the countryside of the UK. It's often called deadly nightshade. It's a herbaceous plant that grows up in the summer and has a peculiar purple flower, but the most toxic part of the plant is the berry. It produces a black grape-like berry, which looks very sweet and very juicy. So again, children are tended to be drawn to this. Just 4 of these berries are enough to kill a child. So it's a very dangerous plant indeed. It's called a Tropa belladonna. Now, from this plant, you can extract atropine, which is used in the medical profession. Way back in the 18th century, Venetian ladies thought that they looked more attractive if they could dilate their pupils. So they used to use this berry and get the juice from it, and then with a small droplet, put drops in their eyes, which dilated their pupils. This is why it's belladonna, beautiful lady, so a Tropa belladonna. But that atropine is still used today if you have eye surgery. Now, the plant that we're going to look at next is called Ruta graveolens. Again, this was a very common ornamental plant at one time, and is still sold as a herb. It is phototoxic, which means that if you get the sap from this plant on your skin, then your skin will start to blister in sunlight. So quite a nasty plant with this phototoxic gene in it. So children running through this plant or playing around this plant can get badly scarred from the blisters that form. The plant leaves are also quite interesting because, again, if you crush the leaves, you get this wonderful sweet smell of nugget. So in the past, children have squeezed the leaves together to get the sweet scent, but then started to get the blisters forming when they're out in sunlight. Now, going down through the garden again, we'll come to a very problematic plant that is often found in on riversides, in woodlands, on spare ground, waste ground, and it's the giant hogweed. Now, this palmate looking plant here with the fingery-like leaves is giant hogweed. Now, this will get up to a height of around about 8 foot. This has only just started growing this season. So in about another 2 months' time, it'll be 8 foot high. It produces great big white flowers, big umbels, which will then produce hundreds and hundreds of seed. Now, again, with this plant, it is phototoxic, which, again, if you get the sap on your skin, and you then go out in the sunlight, you will start to get blisters forming. The issue with this is that once you have the toxin in your system, you will not get rid of the blisters for up to 7 years. So every time you go out in the sunlight, more blisters will form. So a very nasty plant. The rhododendron that we're looking at, obviously a very, very common plant, very ornamental, but in its natural growing conditions, So where it's native from, out in India, around the Himalayas, it produces a pollen. And when bees go into the plant, go into the flower to collect the nectar, they will actually pick up this pollen, which is poisonous. So out in around India, Nepal, they tend not to use honey at all from bees that have foraged on the rhododendron, because the honey will contain the toxins from the plant. So beautiful flower, but poisonous. Just going back to the giant hogweed, often it becomes problematic because the stems are hollow, and so children that don't know the danger of the plant will often cut the stems to make pea shooters from. As they use the pea shooter, obviously they then get sap onto their lips, blisters then form, and in the past children have had huge problems actually breathing because the blisters get so big. So it's quite a problem, and there's no way of getting rid of it, unfortunately. Now this plant is an interesting one. It's aconitum, or often called monkshood. It's an old cottage garden plant, very ornamental. It has very dark blue flowers. So very ornamental indeed, but the whole of the plant is toxic. It was used just recently, back in 2010, by a woman to murder her ex-lover. She had been kicked out of the house by this chap, and they'd had a big falling out. So she decided to get her own back, and she knew the harmful effects of this plant. So she went and found it and got some seed and crushed the seed up, went back into the house, laced a curry which was in the fridge with the seed, and when her ex-lover came home with his new girlfriend, they sat down, ate the curry, and he died within 36 hours of aconitum poisoning. His girlfriend only just survived. So even today we're using plants to kill one another, unfortunately. This large plant is very common again, used as a hedging plant around many people's gardens. It's called laurel. Laurel is very toxic. It produces cyanide, and it's quite common to hear of visitors that come through the garden when they learn about this plant to admit that when they've cut their laurel hedges, they put all the clippings into their car to take the clippings away to the dump, and as they drive along they start to get very lightheaded. In fact, we had one gentleman who admitted that he crashed his car into a lamppost and passed out. And this is all because as you cut the leaves, so cyanide is given off. If you're in an enclosed space like the inside of a car, then the fumes will start to starve your brain of oxygen and you suffer from cyanide poisoning. It's also used an awful lot by the Victorians. They were a great collector of butterflies, and so to preserve the butterfly, they would catch the butterfly and put it in a death jar. The death jar contained a cut leaf of laurel. The butterfly was popped in with the leaf, a lid put on the top, and slowly the cyanide built up, killed the butterfly, but it was perfectly preserved. Now you might wonder why we're looking at rosemary in the poison garden. Rosemary, although we all eat rosemary with our lamb, it's a common herb that everybody uses, actually used to be used to get rid of unborn children. So it was an abortive. And if young ladies go along to spas and therapies, beauty therapies and the like, they're often asked if there's any chance they could be pregnant. And if they are, then the beauticians tend not to use essential oils that contain lavender, because it still does bring on miscarriages. So although popular plant for its herb effects with lamb, with cooking, it can also be used in a very sinister way. Now we're just going through the ivy tunnel, which will lead us back out to the poison garden gates. The ivy can cause irritation. There is a dust that's often on the back of ivy leaves, which will irritate the lungs of people that are susceptible. So within the poison garden, although we've only had a very quick tour, we have over 100 plants in the collection. Many of these haven't been planted out this year because, unfortunately, with the virus, the garden's closed. But hopefully when we reopen, we'll get all of the plants out, including our cannabis plants. We have a license from the Home Office to grow cannabis to use as an educational tool within the poison garden.
That's great, thank you. We have got a couple of questions, if you've got some time to answer them.
Yep, sure.
Okay, so the first question is, how many different types of poisons are there in the garden, and are any of them life-threatening?
Quite a few of them are life-threatening. We must have about at least about 15, 16 different types of toxins contained in plants within the poison garden, and those can be life-threatening.
Thank you. Another one of the questions is, has anyone actually ever been poisoned in the garden, and has that resulted in a closure of the garden or the whole centre?
No, nobody's actually been poisoned within the garden. We do have one plant that we grow called henbane, and henbane gives off quite a strong scent if you have a sensitive nose. And when some people get to that plant, they do pass out, they faint. So it's at the far end of the garden next to a big bench. So we put the patient on the bench and give them some first aid treatment, and we think it's from the scent of the plant. But no, nobody's actually been poisoned within the garden.
Thank you. Is the garden physically dangerous? So could one of the plants actually physically poison you, or could they cause physical long-lasting damage?
Yes, there are many plants within there that can cause you damage. With a lot of these plants, you'd either have to eat an awful lot of them, stuff lots of foliage into you, or eat lots of seed before they have an effect. So yes, they all have the ability to poison you in one way or another, but you do have to eat an awful lot of them.
Thank you. And the last question, because they are flooding in at quite a rate, is, could any of the poisonous plants be used for medicinal purposes?
Yes, some of them can. For example, in the garden, we have a plant called Vinca major. Its common name is the periwinkle. It contains some very, very toxic chemicals within it, but the medical profession use that now in chemotherapy treatment to help people with cancers. So although many of these plants have a very sinister side, we also can harness that and use it for medicinal purposes.
Thank you. And what is the most toxic plant, and what's the least toxic plant in the garden?
I would say within our garden, the most toxic would be a plant called Ricin communis. Ricin communis is often called the castor bean plant, which people grow as an annual in their garden. But from that, you can extract a toxin called ricin, which is the deadliest poison known to man. So it's the most toxic. The least toxic would be, we have a little bunch of stingy nettles. So although people are often getting stung in their garden, they don't have a huge problem with it. The barbs within the nettle itself contain an acid, and if you get a very sensitive skin, then the nettle obviously has a detrimental effect. So it's the least poisonous, really.
Thank you. Could any of these plants be found in the wild or anywhere local to where we might live?
Yes, the Atropodonna, the deadly nightshade, is very common throughout Britain. Grows in woodlands, hedgerows, so it's one to watch out for.
And how old do you have to be to get into the garden?
You have to come into the garden with an adult, or if you're over 18. But all the tours of the poison garden are with a tour guide. We only allow 20 people in on one tour at any time, so you're quite safe.
Has any plant ever been stolen, or someone tried cutting some leaves off a plant? And if so, what have you tried to do to stop that from happening, or to stop them from leaving the garden?
Okay, so in the past, we've had a problem with the cannabis. Some local people realised that we were growing cannabis, so they came in and stole a little bit of it. So now we have to have 24-hour security on the garden, which is something that the Home Office now insist on. So we have 24-hour security, we have cameras above the poison garden watching it all the time, and we also keep the gates locked. And since then we haven't had a problem.
That's great, thank you. Just a couple more as I'm just flicking through them. Is eating a lot of rhubarb fatal? I know you mentioned before about the leaf. Is there any way that the sap from the leaf could get into the rhubarb edible plant bit itself?
No, the toxins are purely held in the leaf itself, and you'd have to eat quite a lot of it. It's not completely fatal, but it does give you a huge stomach upset. And
are there any indications when the garden could reopen? I don't know, given the current circumstances, it might be a bit difficult, but
there's not a date yet, but we're hoping by the middle of the summer we might be able to allow visitors back into the garden.
How did you end up as a head gardener? Did you have to go any through pre-qualifications, or?
Yes, I trained as an apprentice for 2 years in forestry and landscape, and then I went to college for 3 years, left college and then gained experience working for the National Trust for Scotland, and also teaching horticulture till eventually I came to Alnwick.
Do plants come from families, a bit like how animals do?
Yes, they do. All plants are categorized into families. So things with similar flowers, similar leaves, similar structure can all be categorized into families of plants.
Excellent. Are plants kind of poisonous just to humans, or are they poisonous to other animals as well? And if so, does it matter on the size? So say a horse compared to a bee?
Yeah, some plants are poisonous to large and small animals. Ragwort, for example, is another very common plant, and it's a classified plant, so you're supposed to notify the council that you have it, and it's very dangerous because it's poisonous to horses. So if horses graze it, then they can become very unwell.
Excellent, thank you. There are a lot of people saying thank you just for the general tour of the garden and the rest of the centre, which is lovely. Thank you, especially on a nice day like this. How many gardeners does it take to look after the Alnwick Garden?
Right, well, Alnwick Garden is quite a large garden. So there's acres and acres of ornamental gardens. So we have a team of 12 that look after the whole garden.
Okay, excellent. Do you have a Japanese knotweed?
No, we don't, thankfully, because it's a very invasive plant and there's no way of getting rid of it. You can try digging it out, but if you leave a tiny little bit of root, then it just regenerates again. So again, it's become a huge problem in the UK. Although it was brought into the country as an ornamental plant, it's now gone wild and yeah, it grows very quickly and very invasive.
Okay. What is the most kind of visitor famous plant in there in the poison garden? Is there one? I suppose could be a first good question.
I don't think there is one, to be fair. Everybody's intrigued with the cannabis plant, so I would say that really.
Okay, excellent. One more question just come in. What is your favourite plant?
My favourite plant in the poison garden would be the aconitum, the monk's hood, that was used in the curry to kill someone, just because it's a very ornamental plant. It has fantastic blue flowers.
Okay, and I suppose flip it on your head. on its head, what is your least favourite plant?
My least favourite plant would be a celandine. Again, it's a very common plant. It's a weed in most people's garden. It has a toxic sap that is used to actually burn warts off, but it too is very invasive. It seeds everywhere, and so gives us a real problem.
Okay, thank you. There are no more questions coming in, but I'm sure if there are any more questions, we can send them across over to yourself, if that's
Yeah,
all
sure.
right.
Yeah, no problem at all.
Excellent, wonderful. Thank you for taking the time, and thank you for the team back in the back end of Alnwick Garden for giving us this virtual tour for Alnwick Gardens.
Okay, thanks very much indeed, and perhaps we'll see some of you in the future at the garden.
That's great, thank you.
Okay, thank you.